The global economic landscape finds itself in an increasingly turbulent state, with trade tensions and geopolitical uncertainties converging to cast a long shadow over international commerce. As President Trump's self-imposed tariff deadlines loom, large nations worldwide are scrambling to navigate a complex web of negotiations, retaliatory threats, and shifting supply chains, with the recent G7 summit serving as a tense backdrop for these high-stakes discussions. At the forefront of this economic maelstrom are the impending Liberation Day tariffs, set to resume their most punishing duties on July 9 if new agreements are not forged or existing pauses extended. European Union nations, despite recent stalled progress, are reportedly pushing for a trade deal with the United States modeled on the recently firmed-up US-UK agreement. This approach, according to the Financial Times, would see a 10% reciprocal tariff serve as a baseline. A compromise aimed at averting Trump's threat of tariffs escalating to as high as 50% on EU imports. Across the Atlantic, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's government has similarly threatened to hike tariffs on U.S. steel and aluminum imports by late July, a direct response to Washington's unilateral increase of its own levies to 50% on these materials. While both Trump and Carney expressed optimism for a deal at the G7, the underlying threats underscore the fragility of these trade relationships. Japan too finds itself in a precarious position, despite Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba's efforts at the G7 to persuade Trump to drop a 25% tariff on Japanese cars and a 24% reciprocal tariff on other imports. No agreement was reached, leaving negotiations in a fog. The reverberations of these tariff policies are already being felt across industries and economies. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, while holding interest rates steady this week, noted the profound uncertainty surrounding the tariffs' impact on prices. "We're beginning to see some effects, and we do expect to see more of them over the coming months," Powell stated, adding that the pass-through of tariffs to consumer price inflation is a whole process that's very uncertain. He highlighted that substantially larger tariffs were coming and that would mean higher inflation, hindering the Fed's progress on bringing down inflation. Businesses are directly bearing the brunt. German car manufacturers have incurred an estimated $535 million in costs due to tariffs in April alone, according to the VDA Auto Industry Group. Toy giant Hasbro announced a 3% workforce reduction, citing increased tariff costs on Chinese imports, while Japan's Mitsubishi Motors is hiking U.S. vehicle prices by an average of 2.1% to offset rising expenses. Perhaps most starkly, home goods retailer At Home filed for bankruptcy, with its CFO, Jeremy Aguilar, explicitly blaming tariffs as the final blow that intensified the financial pressure on the company. The uncertainty surrounding tariffs has also led to a slump in U.S. tariff-hit small parcel shipments from China, squeezing exporters like Shine, and China's rare earth magnet exports, particularly to the U.S., have seen a steep drop in May. Beyond direct trade duties, the U.S. is also leveraging tariffs to reshape global supply chains and exert geopolitical influence. Taiwan has joined the U.S. in blacklisting Huawei Technologies company, widening the tech fight with China. Reports indicate the U.S. is pushing Vietnam to reduce its reliance on Chinese tech components and goods destined for American markets, part of a broader strategy to decouple supply chains. China, in turn, has reported mixed economic performance for May, with retail sales jumping as export goods are redirected domestically, while factory output has slowed due to the higher U.S. tariffs. This strategic competition extends to critical sectors, with the U.S. Commerce Department investigating areas like semiconductors, pharma products, and critical minerals for potential national security-related duties, further signaling a move towards a more protectionist and localized industrial policy. Adding an unexpected and volatile layer to this complex landscape is the escalating conflict between Israel and Iran, which has direct implications for global energy security and China's strategic interests. For years, Beijing has cultivated a close relationship with Tehran, making cheap Iranian crude a cornerstone of its energy mix. Last year, Iranian oil accounted for as much as 15% of China's crude imports, with China being the world's largest oil buyer. However, Israel's attacks on Iran threaten to disrupt these vital supplies and potentially block the Strait of Hormuz. a critical waterway through which hundreds of billions of dollars in oil and gas, including from China's largest supplier Saudi Arabia, are shipped annually. While China maintains an estimated 90 to 100 days of strategic petroleum reserves, the crisis underscores Beijing's urgent push for greater energy independence through a massive increase in renewable energy and electrification. As Neil Beveridge, head of Asia-Pacific research at Bernstein, noted, the key takeaway for President Xi Jinping's administration from this crisis will be to double down on its self-sufficiency drive. The conflict also tests China's aspirations as a global mediator, highlighting the limits of its diplomatic influence despite recent efforts to broker deals like the Saudi-Iran rapprochement. Experts like Jingdong Yuan of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute observe that while China rhetorically supports nations seen as unfairly treated by the West, its approach to regional conflicts remains always cautious, underscoring the complexities of its foreign policy ambitions. As the July 9 deadline approaches, the global economy braces for further shifts. The intertwining of trade policy, corporate strategies, and geopolitical flashpoints creates an environment of unprecedented uncertainty. Whether through negotiated deals, extended pauses, or the full implementation of threatened tariffs, the coming months will undoubtedly reshape international commerce, accelerate supply chain reconfigurations, and test the resilience of economies navigating a fractured global order where economic and security interests are increasingly inseparable. As the global economic landscape braces for a pivotal moment, a series of high-stakes trade negotiations and looming tariff deadlines are sending ripples of uncertainty across continents, leaving businesses, consumers, and central banks grappling with an unpredictable future. With President Trump's self-imposed Liberation Day tariff pause set to expire on July 9, the world is watching intently as the U.S. engages in fraught discussions with key trading partners, simultaneously recalibrating its own economic outlook amid the escalating trade tensions. The G7 summit recently concluded in Canada served as a crucial backdrop for these intense discussions, though it yielded mixed results. While President Trump and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced a limited trade agreement reducing tariffs on British car and aerospace imports, this singular success stands in stark contrast to the stalled progress with other major economies. The deal, which includes an annual quota of 100,000 UK vehicles at a 10% tariff and removes duties on aerospace goods, notably leaves steel and aluminum tariffs unresolved, with US officials eyeing a quota-based exemption. However, even with this agreement, luxury automaker Bentley's CEO Frank-Stefan Walliser noted that tariff uncertainty remains, highlighting the pervasive anxiety in the business community. Focus has now shifted intensely to the European Union and Canada, both facing the prospect of significantly higher U.S. levies. The EU, the U.S.'s largest trading partner, is reportedly pushing for a deal modeled on the US-UK agreement, reportedly resigned to a 10% reciprocal tariff as a starting point. This comes despite Trump's persistent threats of imposing tariffs up to 50% on EU imports once the July 9 deadline lapses, a move that would dramatically escalate the current trade friction. The existing trade deficit with the EU, which expanded to approximately $115 billion in April despite current tariffs, remains a key point of contention for the Trump administration, which has historically linked tariff rates to trade imbalances. Meanwhile, north of the border, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's government has threatened to hike tariffs on U.S. steel and aluminum imports by late July, a direct response to Trump's recent ballooning of U.S. levies to 50%. Despite expressions of optimism from both leaders at the G7, Trump acknowledged different concepts on trade, underscoring the deep divisions. This tit-for-tat dynamic highlights the immediate economic repercussions for industries dependent on cross-border trade, with Canada already facing significant U.S. duties on steel, aluminum, and autos. Japan, another major U.S. ally, has also found itself in the crosshairs. Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba's efforts to persuade Trump to relax a 25% tariff on Japanese cars and a 24% reciprocal tariff on other Japanese imports, paused until July 9, failed to yield an agreement at the G7. Ishiba conceded that there are still some points on which the two sides are not on the same page, leaving Japan's economy vulnerable to a potential recession if tariffs are fully reimposed. This stalemate is not only impacting Japan's auto companies but is also casting a shadow over Ishiba's political future, though some analysts suggest that avoiding a rushed, unsatisfactory deal could play in his favor domestically. A recent Reuters survey indicated that over 70% of Japanese firms expected the tariff impact and had not adjusted investment plans, suggesting a degree of preparedness. Yet Mitsubishi Motors has already announced a 2.1% average price hike on new U.S. vehicles, directly passing tariff costs to consumers. The broad economic impact of these tariffs is becoming increasingly evident. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell has repeatedly emphasized the profound uncertainty surrounding the pass-through of tariffs to consumer price inflation, noting that the Fed is still waiting to see the effects of the tariffs on prices. While the central bank held interest rates steady this week, Powell acknowledged that substantially larger tariffs were coming and that would mean higher inflation, contributing to an upward revision of core personal consumption expenditures (PCE) estimates for 2025. This uncertainty about who ultimately bears the cost, manufacturers, exporters, importers, retailers, or consumers, is a significant concern for policymakers. Credit reporting agency TransUnion reported that U.S. consumers are indeed becoming more pessimistic about rising prices fueled by tariffs. Beyond macroeconomic indicators, specific industries and companies are feeling the pinch. Hasbro, the renowned toy manufacturer, announced a 3% workforce reduction, directly attributing it to higher U.S. tariffs on toys imported from China. Retailer At Home filed for bankruptcy, with its CFO Jeremy Aguilar explicitly stating that the volatility of the current tariff environment intensified financial pressure and accelerated the need for a comprehensive solution, particularly affecting its ability to plan key seasonal orders due to reliance on Chinese goods. The UN Trade Agency has warned of a global investment decline, while a Bain & Company study projects a slowdown in global luxury sales in 2025, both citing tariffs and broader conflicts as contributing factors. Even the travel industry is affected, with JetBlue cutting flights due to consumers pulling back on spending amidst macroeconomic uncertainty. The trade war's effects are particularly pronounced in U.S.-China relations. A Bloomberg report highlighted a slump in China's small parcel shipments to the U.S. in May, severely squeezing exporters like Shein and contributing to a significant drop in bilateral trade. Chinese exports of rare earth magnets critical for many high-tech industries and defense applications also saw a steep decline to the U.S. in May. While a recent U.S.-China trade truce in London offered some respite, the issue of military-use rare earth export restrictions remains unresolved. The U.S. is also leveraging its influence to push countries like Vietnam to decouple from Chinese technology, further widening the tech fight, as evidenced by Taiwan blacklisting Huawei. China's ambassador to the United States, Xie Feng, addressing the U.S.-China Business Council, reiterated that mutual benefit has all along been the defining feature of China-U.S. economic and trade cooperation, advocating for dialogue and cooperation over protectionism, which he likened to drinking poison to quench thirst. He stressed that China's sovereignty, security, and development interests are the red line that should not be crossed, while emphasizing principles of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation. From China's perspective, its economic transformation over the past 40 years provides a unique context to these trade dynamics. As Kaiser Kuei of the World Economic Forum notes, China's dramatic economic transformation from an impoverished rural nation to a technological superpower was not merely a result of market liberalization but built upon critical foundations laid during the Mao era, including land reform, heavy industry investments, and public health initiatives. Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening strategy, which notably avoided the shock therapy adopted by other post-socialist states, strategically implemented a dual-track approach and established special economic zones (SEZs) that became engines of industrialization and integration into the global economy. This strategic vision, coupled with massive investments in infrastructure, the attraction of foreign direct investment (FDI) for technology transfer, gradual SOE reform, and significant human capital development, e.g., college enrollment skyrocketing from 8% to over 50% between 1995 to 2015, has underpinned China's rise. The country's rapid adoption of digital technologies, from mobile payments to e-commerce giants, further solidified its position, driven by both private sector innovation and state-led informatization campaigns targeting key technologies like AI, semiconductors, and EVs. As the July 9 deadline draws near, the global economic environment remains fraught with uncertainty, compounded by geopolitical conflicts like the Israel-Iran situation, which are further clouding the outlook for central banks and investors. The U.S. Commerce Department is also concluding investigations into sectors deemed of national interest, such as semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and critical minerals, potentially leading to new duties on foreign-made products. Indeed, President Trump has explicitly stated his intention to impose pharmaceutical tariffs to bring companies back to America. The Supreme Court is even being asked to consider striking down some of Trump's sweeping tariffs, indicating the legal challenges accompanying the economic ones. The coming weeks will be critical in shaping the contours of global trade. Whether the U.S. and its partners can bridge their different concepts on trade, or whether a new wave of tariffs will fundamentally reshape supply chains and consumer costs, remains to be seen. The ongoing strategic re-evaluation of global economic ties, exemplified by the U.S. pushing countries like Vietnam to decouple from Chinese tech, signals a long-term shift in how nations approach trade security and economic interdependence. The world is watching to see if diplomacy can avert further escalation, or if the current policy of economic leverage will lead to a more fragmented, costly, and unpredictable global marketplace. As geopolitical tensions continue to simmer across the globe, a recent confluence of events reveals the intricate dance of power diplomacy and technological advancement shaping the 21st century's strategic landscape. From the volatile Middle East to the contested waters of the Pacific and into the realm of microrobotics, the threads of global influence are being rewoven, with China's evolving role at the forefront of this complex tapestry. The escalating Israel-Iran conflict, particularly the specter of a U.S. military intervention alongside Israel, casts a stark light on the limitations of China's burgeoning geopolitical power. Beijing, which famously brokered a peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia in 2023, had heralded that moment as a triumph for its diplomacy and a clear signal of its emergence as a major power broker in the Middle East. However, with President Trump openly contemplating a U.S. attack on Iran, China finds itself in a precarious position. Half of China's vital oil imports transit through the Strait of Hormuz off Iran's southern coast, and Tehran has long been a key partner in Beijing's efforts to counter American influence in the region. Yet despite these profound strategic interests, China appears largely unable to militarily defend Iran, especially if the United States becomes involved. The reality is they don't actually have the capability to insert Chinese forces to defend Iran's installations, noted Zach Cooper, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, suggesting Beijing would likely offer only very quietly provide some material support, some rhetorical support, and maybe some humanitarian aid. While stability in the Middle East is China's preferred outcome, a prolonged U.S. entanglement in the region could paradoxically offer Beijing a strategic advantage by diverting American military resources away from Asia. The outcome of any potential U.S. strike on Iran is poised to offer critical lessons for Beijing, potentially influencing its assessment of Washington's willingness to use force, particularly concerning a possible U.S. defense of Taiwan. Despite its close ties with Tehran, China's official rhetoric regarding the current conflict has remained strikingly measured. Following a call with Russian President Vladimir Putin, Chinese leader Xi Jinping called for a ceasefire but notably avoided overtly criticizing Israel for violating Iran's sovereignty. Similarly, while China's top diplomat Wang Yi expressed opposition to Israel's attacks in a call with his Israeli counterpart, he stopped short of condemning them, a term he had used in a separate call with Iran. Julian Gewertz, a former senior China policy official at the White House, observed that Beijing is scrambling to keep up with the rapid pace of events and prioritizing looking after Chinese citizens and assets in the region rather than any sort of broader diplomatic initiative, evidenced by China's focus on evacuating over 1,000 of its citizens from Israel and Iran. Online discussions within China, though heavily censored, have reflected a pragmatic view of Iran's military capabilities and the limits of Chinese support. Zhu Zhou, a Middle East expert in Beijing, articulated that China cannot offer Iran unconditional protection against the US and Israel, suggesting Beijing's leverage is primarily confined to the United Nations Security Council. This tempered response mirrors that of Russia, another key partner in what some in Washington dubbed the axis of upheaval, a quartet including China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, ostensibly united by opposition to the US-dominated world order. The relative inaction of both Beijing and Moscow in the face of the Assad regime's overthrow in Syria last year, despite their ties, further highlights the economic constraints influencing China's foreign policy given its deep integration into the global economy. China, which buys virtually all of Iran's sanctioned oil at a discount and relies on the Strait of Hormuz for additional energy imports, faces significant economic headwinds from higher energy prices, a major concern for its sluggish economy. Beyond energy, Iran offers China a vital foothold in the Middle East to advance its interests against the substantial U.S. military presence in the region. Chinese analysts often argue that Beijing's non-interventionist stance on issues like human rights makes it a more attractive mediator in the Middle East, capable of breakthroughs where the U.S. falters. However, this perception is not universally shared. Barbara Leaf, a former Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, suggests that Middle Eastern officials view China's role as purely commercial and economic, inherently prioritizing its own interests. This sentiment is reinforced by Beijing's reluctance to pressure partners like the Houthi rebels to cease attacks on shipping off Yemen except when Chinese vessels are directly involved, thereby undercutting its standing as a neutral arbiter. This complex geopolitical landscape is further complicated by ongoing military posturing in the Indo-Pacific. Simultaneously, U.S., NATO, and Pacific allies have been observed sailing warships near China's coast, a clear signal of continued strategic competition and a demonstration of collective resolve. This maritime activity underscores a broader strategy of deterrence and presence in a region where China is rapidly expanding its naval capabilities and territorial claims. Meanwhile, a nascent thaw in U.S.-Pakistan relations, while potentially offering new avenues for cooperation, also presents challenges regarding their respective relationships with Iran and China, adding another layer to the intricate web of regional alliances and rivalries. Amidst these geopolitical machinations, China continues to push the boundaries of military technology. A recent report from the National University of Defense Technology (NUDT) showcased a groundbreaking mosquito-sized microdrone developed by a Chinese military robotics lab. Featured on state broadcasters CCTV7, this miniature bionic robot, barely visible to the eye, is designed for information reconnaissance and special missions on the battlefield. Liang Haxiang, a student at NUDT, demonstrated the drone, highlighting its tiny wings and hair-thin legs, emphasizing the immense engineering challenge of fitting sensors, power devices, and control circuits into such a minuscule form factor. This development, reminiscent of Norway's palm-sized Black Hornet micro-UAV used by armed forces globally, signifies China's relentless pursuit of advanced covert operational capabilities, potentially altering the dynamics of intelligence gathering and targeted strikes in future conflicts. The convergence of these events, the Middle East's boiling point, the strategic jostling in the Pacific, and the relentless march of military technology, paints a vivid picture of a world in flux. China's nuanced, often constrained role in the Middle East, juxtaposed with its assertive military modernization and the ongoing demonstrations of Allied force in its immediate vicinity, underscores the multifaceted challenges and opportunities defining its ascent. As global powers navigate these turbulent waters, the interplay between diplomacy, economic leverage, and cutting-edge technology will undoubtedly continue to shape the contours of international relations, with future developments promising to be as unpredictable as they are significant.